Hello again. So this is episode 8 of the development diary, Fragile Existence. I know it's been over a month since I last recorded. I'm not really sure why I've left it that long, but I have been working on quite a few new things and keen to have a sort of talk about it. I'm not actually going to load up the main project file at all. I've been working in the planet generation system for the last month or so. And so if you remember from last time, I had a quad sphere and made up of 6 sides of a cube, squashed out, and what I was doing was applying simplex noise onto that basic sphere model, and various layers of simplex noise allowed you to get the continent shape, which I was flattening out, and then creating the depth of the oceans around that. And then I could add, I was sort of gearing up to adding much more biome functionality. I actually built the entire UI for this, and you could add biomes individually. It's taken a while because the resolutions are high, and each individual one could be sort of changed and tinkered with, and it was based on the sort of the height map system. So I was applying color and then eventually a gradient of a texture, to the location based on the height, and it worked. It looked okay, but I just couldn't help but think that I wanted it to be a bit more dynamic, a bit more configurable. Now the problem with having a planet that's purely based on noise functions is that you kind of just move sliders around until it sort of comes out as something interesting, and it can certainly do that, but I was just finding that I was really yearning for something a bit more physical based, something that I could build planets that were modeled on real systems that we have here on Earth, and so this is where I'm at. I know it looks like something a bit strange, and this is because the colors and the height are just representative of other things or parameters, so to speak. This is a climate model of a planet that is based on Voronoi noise. Now the Voronoi sections that you can see, these little sort of polygons, are also a noise function, but it's actually a noise function that I can be more aware of. I can know where the center point for each of these individual little polygons is on the sphere, and I can randomize this, so I can create whatever sort of shapes I want and whatever density of these polygon shapes I want. It was actually, I discovered it when I was doing some work with craters. So I was reading a blog by someone who was working on Kerbal Space Program, and they came up with this way of creating crater shapes on the surface of the mesh. So this isn't a texture, this is actually the mesh being deformed based on Voronoi cell deformation. So the noise, you can't really see it here, but the center point of these craters is actually the same as the center point of the polygons we saw, only over on the other sphere. So say for example the center of this, and instead of drawing it as a polygon, what we're doing over here is ignoring that distance function and only sort of caring about the bit that's closest to the feature point. And so we can actually change that shape based on a curve, which we have here. And so at the outer edge of the crater, we sort of have the little lip function, and then we go down and we have a little bulge in the center. So it's like the profile of each individual radius of a crater. And so obviously we've got the other side up here as well, which gives you the ability to sort of mold and shape these little crater patterns. And I can change the radius, the depth, and the frequency. I can't do it at runtime because I haven't sort of set all that up and I haven't parameterized it as well as I would like. And so you can see I'm just working on one mesh here, but it's easily applied to an entire sphere. So that gave me the inspiration to try using Voronoi noise across the entire sphere. And I can actually also do tectonic plates. This is based on some other blog posts that I was reading. I think somebody did a hex-based planet sphere, which was procedural, and the way they'd done it was by using uniformly distributed Voronoi noise like this. This actually isn't as uniform. This is deliberately more randomized. The shapes are all over the place, and I actually like that. So what he had done is modeled an entire climate by sort of building this hex-based Voronoi structure, and then that gave him a kind of a grid to work with. So you can find the neighboring cells, and you can basically just say, okay, so this is this biome, this has this much rainfall, this is this temperature, and move moisture around the planet. And it was a very inspiring blog post, and it's led to this. So let me try and explain what's here. We're not actually showing the tectonic plates at this point. I might overlay that video whilst I'm discussing this, but the tectonic plates are actually behind here, and the way they work is they're much larger cells, and then there's a distance function similar to what we did with the craters, which increases the sort of the perceived height of individual cells, so that as we go towards the edge of the cell, it's actually got more height. And so then what you sort of observe is that with these tectonic plates, as they come up against the next tectonic plate, you see that the height is much higher as it's sort of pressing against the next one, which has its own distance function, so might not be quite as high up on that edge as well. And so what this sort of ends up giving me is a mask in order to build the shapes of mountains. I haven't actually applied that on what you're seeing here, but the idea is that at the edge of the tectonic plates, you apply the height that mass provides to the overall function that calculates the height of the land, and that will automatically give you the shapes of mountains in the correct place, much like it is on Earth, where it's sort of the mountain regions are very close to the edges of tectonic plates. Now, in reality, tectonic plates do diverge as well as approach each other, and they do in fact just slide alongside each other. That's how you get earthquakes. But for the purposes of this model, which needs to be greatly simplified, we basically get mountains or island regions at the tectonic plate edges. That's not fully implemented yet, but that's the intention. So what we have here is actually the biome level. Okay, so the color represents the temperature. So at the equator, we're seeing where the temperature is, in this case, it's red. So the land is colored and the sea is black. And so red is the hottest regions, and the sort of very dark blue is the coldest regions. And so the edge, as you can see, is defined by where the ocean is. And it actually looks already at this sort of this level of sort of density, it actually looks quite believable. I've biased it so that it sort of expands, it kind of grows in a way that sticks to sort of equatorial regions. So it tends not to go too much on the poles, or at least the way I've generated the land masses in this case is that I have sort of a number of starting points which represent the maximum number of continents you can have, and then each starting point expands outwards by various functions that pick the cells closest to it and keep adding sort of height around it. And so then what we do is move to randomly select one of the ones that it's just added height to, and then we do the same thing around that one. So a random number of neighbors get colored in as continents, and we just keep going. And what we're doing is we're alternating between starting points across the globe, and each point is expanding outwards until you get the actual land mass that you've sort of aiming for. So what I've got is a land to sea ratio, and the algorithm is trying to get that that ratio as exact as possible. So I'll show that in a moment, but what I also want to make a comment about is the height that we're seeing here. So this is related to what I just finished sort of doing today, which is a system of moisture moving around from the ocean via wind currents. And so this is where the climate part of this model is being implemented. So the idea is the higher height represents more precipitation. So you see a lot of rainfall is actually still over the ocean. So the higher points are more water falling, and the flatter points are hardly any water is fell. So what I'm doing is I'm using a sort of vector field. So from each point, and sort of finding a point as we move along with the wind direction, and checking at regular intervals which is the closest sail to that point, and then applying some of the moisture from the starting sail, which is generally going to be oceans, to each tile that it passes as it goes along. Now I've actually got sort of proper wind sails as well, and I'm sort of tinkering with the settings still. I mean, it's not based on real values at all, so you kind of just have to keep playing with it until it feels right. But I actually have the wind moving so east to west near the equator, like it is on Earth. And so at the equator, the wind should move this way. And as you move away from the equator towards the temperate regions, it sort of starts to curve inwards. I know you don't really get an impression of that from this because there's so many cells providing moisture and precipitation that it kind of becomes a bit muddled. But further up in the temperate zone, the wind actually goes in the opposite direction. And near the Arctic Circle, it actually starts going east to west again with much slower wind speed. And so what you do is actually observe is that you see these higher points are actually around the edges of the landmass to a large degree. And you do get the tropical zones as well, where you see a lot of the wind is sort of coursing through the equatorial region. And so maybe not so much here. You see the precipitation fell before it reached the land there, but there was quite a spike. And you sort of start to see the emergence of some sort of desert regions. It's quite hot still here, but it's relatively flat. Same here, and this is very flat all along here. And the Arctic, the polar regions are actually quite flat as well. So you see a bit more rain around the edges, much like we do here in Europe. You sort of see quite a bit of rainfall in the temperate regions, and sort of less rain inland. So I think it's doing a fairly good job. And so what I think I should do is actually back out, and I'm just doing this in editor today because it's much easier to tweak the settings here at the moment. And so this just reloads the entire planet, and this is what I get when I first bring it up because the resolution is really low. And if we bump that up, it actually calculates for each resolution. So if we get to there, it is pretty slow for now because it's not working on the GPU. And as you can see, we've got a entirely new land shape. Now we've got nothing on the South Polar region, and we've got a lot of spikes in the equatorial region here. Look at that tropical zone. And then we've got much flatter bits where the deserts might be here, and then sort of a bit of rainfall further up. Like I say, it still needs tinkering, but I can also forgive my code, it's very rough at the moment. This is very prototypey, but I can change the land-sea ratio. So if we want only 10% land, we can run that, and then the algorithm will try to match only 100 tiles, I believe. We're using 1,000 at the moment, and as you see, admittedly the spikiness gets pretty bad with this much ocean. Yeah, that's the only little bits of land that we have, and wow, the amount of rainfall is quite a bit, and it should be matching the sea ocean ratio pretty well. if I get this up to a much higher ratio, and if I change the surface temperature, I can make it a much colder planet, as we see. So again, if we increase the resolution, you can see there's the ocean in black, and it's much colder even at the equatorial regions here. So we can sort of quite dynamically see that it's possible to create moon-like biomes, very barren biomes, sorry. And so the colder it is and the less rainfall you get, the more sort of barren the actual land surface is going to be. So we're still getting rain around the edges. You find that the more land there is, the less exposure we actually get to precipitation. That's because the land doesn't actually generate moisture at the moment. It's only being generated in the oceans. I'm also not moving around the temperature gradients at all. So the temperature is purely based on the height from the equator at the moment. You see a lot of the rainfall is just going straight back into the ocean. It's quite curious. I actually kind of like how these look. They look like very futuristic, sort of created planets. I almost kind of want to see if I can integrate something like this in game, but I'm not really sure it would have much use. So the other benefits of this system is that the actual biome regions will be not only identifiable, because I can change each of these individual cells based on the temperature, the final temperature and the final amount of precipitation. So for example, on the Earth type planet, in the hot zones you'll get jungle regions, and in the areas that aren't getting much rainfall but are very hot, you get the desert regions, and then you get temperate forests further up with a little bit of rain but quite cooler, and there'll actually be ice caps and that kind of thing integrated as well. But not only that, because I'm not basing things on a height map, it's a lot easier for me to have a sort of flat work area which I can use as my nav mesh. So I'm sort of started working on this, but I don't have anything to show yet. So the idea will be that I use an A-star algorithm based on the vertices that belong to the surface will be added to a nav mesh, and I can simply traverse the actual the planet region itself that isn't mountainous or isn't an ocean, simply by using the grid of the vertices themselves. Other things I actually want to do involve the splat mapping. So I want to be able to paint down textures based on the biome, and this is something I really couldn't do when I was using just simplex noise, because you had no real sense of location when you're doing that. So now I can paint a texture based on what the biome is, and I can sort of overlay particular textures based on that particular biome. I also would like to try to do some virtual texturing, which is what they did in Planetary Annihilation. There are many blogs from the guys that worked on that as well that I've been reading. And whilst I'm not necessarily going for the super cartoony style that they have, virtual texturing is a way of allowing an awful lot of textures to be used on the planet and just sort of loaded in procedurally. Unity doesn't really have great support for this right now. I'm only using the URP renderer, and that doesn't have virtual texturing yet. So I may have to look into making my own system. The other thing from Planetary Annihilation that they used to make their planets was something called Constructive Solid Geometry, or CSG. And so the idea is that you can actually plant sort of game objects on the surface, and the mesh will use a Boolean operation to subtract or add the mesh shape. So you could make craters, instead of doing it the way I'm doing it, for example, you could have a crater that you sort of pop down and then you apply it, and the actual mesh of the planet will subtract the crater shape, and it'll just be inherent on the mesh itself. And so that lets you do a lot of more interesting things. You could create cracks in the ground. You could create mountains that sort of pop up where you want them and actually add them as part of the mesh. So these are the sort of things I'm thinking of. And obviously, I have been consumed by the actual planet procedural generation. I knew I would. Once I started, it was going to be a proverbial black hole. And I'm really happy that I've moved on to this Voronoi structure, because the amount of freedom I ultimately get with this means that I'll be able to do some really cool things. And I'll have planets that feel alive. When you create a purely procedural planet, it never really has much character. I think this is the way to ensure that you always end up with something interesting, because it's based on real physical models. It's, you're getting continents that look like continents. You're getting the biomes where they should be. It allows people to sort of come up with gameplay that's a bit more based on real knowledge than just trying to learn the rules of how planets are built in the game. I don't know. I'm sure I've gone on for far too long about this, but as you can see, we're already getting some pretty good planets here, and moons are based on the same system. Gas planets will still need an entirely separate module. I also built an atmosphere. It sounds like an afterthought right now. It's not really designed for this particular version of the planet system. It was sort of designed for the original one. So you can change various settings, the fall off, the transparency, and you can even change the color as well to show different gases. But since then, Sebastian Lag has come out with his latest atmosphere coding adventure, and now I'm convinced I can probably do something far more impressive, because this is based on one color, and as you can see, it's just sort of behind the object at the moment. I thought it would be plenty good enough, but I'm probably going to want to do something a bit more impressive. And if I have wind currents, it'll be a lot easier to do clouds based on those currents as well. So that's definitely interesting. So I haven't actually really loaded up the main Fragile Existence project file in quite a while. I'm just trying to get these planets right. And it's a really important step, to be fair. Everything is going to be governed by the planets in the game. And obviously I'm really looking forward to getting them in the game, but I want to get them right. I'm going to try not to get too consumed with this procedural stuff, but it's definitely very interesting at the moment. And I'll leave it there. Thanks for watching.